you everyone for taking some time out of your Tuesday evening to come and listen to me talk. Gordon mentioned my name is Jen Cavexis. I'm with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. So tonight I'm going to talk just very briefly on what the coalition is, how we got started, but really focus a little bit more on the High Park Fire itself. Because you're the ecology group, I threw in a smattering of wildfire ecology, mostly focused on ponderosa systems. And then really talking mostly about the post-fire restoration techniques that we used for the High Park restoration efforts that went on after the fire. And then just wrapping up with a couple of things that we've got going on and coming up next. And I should start by saying I am not a forester. I'm not a wildfire ecologist. I'm a bit of a Jane of all trades when it comes to watersheds. I do my best to answer everyone's questions, but I will often plead ignorance, and I'm always willing to find answers that I can't give to you right away. I try not to lie when I'm on the spot to give a question that I can't answer right away. So I'm not going to belabor the point of what the High Park Fire was. Your community, better than many in this watershed, know the details of the event. 2012, June 9th, we're coming up on the 3rd anniversary. We had a wildfire that started. Its eventual extent ended up being slightly more than 87,000 acres. The key point that I want us to keep we need to keep in mind when we think about this particular wildfire is that, like many wildfires, this one did not burn evenly across the landscape. It was very patchy in the intensity, and that plays a big role in thinking about the impacts and how we deal with the impacts. So broadly speaking, the High Park Fire had over the whole burn area, had approximately slightly under half of it was considered high to moderate severity burn. The rest of it was considered low to unburned. Pretty much within a couple days of the fire starting, there was a very quick recognition that this wasn't just going to be a little fire. And based on other experiences that we've had up and down the Front Range and across the West, there was a quick realization that with a fire of this scale and this intensity, that we were likely going to see many significant impacts for a long time after the fire. Obviously, for communities who are in the middle of the path of a fire, the immediate concern and fear is your lives, your homes, your safety, which obviously makes perfect sense. But wildfires and their problems don't stop when the fires are put out. As all of us know, for people who live in and around the burn area, the problems keep going on. And they affect a lot of different aspects and resources in the watershed. So as soon as the fire sort of tipped that point of being like, oh, it's just a little waterfowl to, ooh, a bunch of different groups of people started coming together and starting to talk about, well, what is going to happen? What are the issues that we're going to be most worried about? How do we figure out where we're going to do something? And what does that something look like? And so quickly, a bunch of these different threads, different nonprofits, mostly based out of Fort Collins, who work on restoration, local water utilities, Larimer County, different business entities, and just concerned citizens, eventually all found each other and started talking and trying to think through these things together. That initial effort, an informal coalition, was formed called the High Park Restoration Coalition. And so together that entity met regularly for that first sort of 6 months after the fire and started thinking about how to prioritize those different burn area issues and post-fire issues that we were expecting to see. The recognition that it would be more than a one-year problem that we were going to be dealing with for the post-fire impacts led that group to decide that there would be benefit to formalizing that informal coalition into a formal nonprofit to be able to continue working on post-fire impacts, and then also start using that collaborative model to start looking at other issues in the watershed and how can we potentially work together to get ahead of the curve of some of these hazards that are in our watershed. And so that's what became the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. So a subset of those initial entities in the High Park Restoration Coalition formed the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. And so we have a board. It's made up of a lot of those same entities: City of Fort Collins, City of Greeley, Larimer County, people from Tribe Unlimited, people from Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, some unaffiliated citizens, and we're trying to expand our board as well. So we continue to work on post-fire issues. Our mission, you'll see, is not written specifically in terms of the High Park Fire and dealing with the burn area issues, and that was done on purpose, because we wanted to be able to think about any of the high priority issues and hazards affecting the watershed and how we can work together to plan and do on-the-ground work to help address those. And initially, our footprint was just looking at what we refer to as the upper watershed. So the Poudre watershed from the canyon mouth up, including the North Fork, Main Stem, Riss Canyon. We've since, the Great Flood of 2013 has since prompted us to move downstream and start working with the lower, what we call the lower watershed, on some riparian issues in that area as well. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about wildfires and their importance historically to the ecology of these areas. And I'm really just going to focus on the ponderosa, mixed ponderosa type systems. Probably most of you know that as our forest types change with elevation, so does the forest types' interactions with wildfire. But because we're mostly in the ponderosa zone here, I thought I'd just focus on the ponderosas. You know, when we talk about wildfires, we never talk about wanting to get rid of wildfires, no matter, they are an integral part of what has, and having them continue to be a driver in this ecosystem is an important component of the ecology of these ecosystems. When we think about ponderosa-dominated forests, historically, I should say, over the course of the evolution of ponderosas, they've created a lot of adaptations that allow them to exist and coexist with wildfire. Wildfire is a real companion for maintaining the ecology of ponderosas. Ponderosas have these different adaptations. I've just pointed out a few of them here. There's more of them. But things like, as ponderosas mature, they get these really thick barks. I mean, it's like that really iconic characteristic of mature ponderosa is that beautiful orange, big bark. That is one of those characteristics that helps it survive sort of low to moderate fires. Also, this ability for it to drop its lower limbs means that ponderosas don't have a lot of ladder fuels close to the ground. So those, just a few examples of how ponderosas, because of those adaptations, when low to moderate fires come through, they do okay. And in fact, the fires are kind of doing their competitive work for them, because those low to moderate fires will help get rid of its competitors in the ecosystem. So more shade-tolerant species like Doug fir are eliminated because of that interaction with those types of fires. So this interaction between ponderosa systems and these types of mixed fire regimes helps to maintain these diverse, open ponderosa mosaic habitats dominated by bigger, mature trees. What happens over time is that as people move into these areas, we start to suppress fires, we start to do other land use changes that change that interaction. And in particular, the general theory is that as we suppress fires, we take that driver out of the system, and ponderosa's companion, a fire that helps eliminate that competition, is gone, which means we end up getting more tree densities and we end up getting more ground cover and ladder fuels. And so instead of having these low to moderate fires, with every once in a while having a high intensity crown fire, we end up having fewer fires and more crown fires with higher intensities that have higher impacts to them. That's like the very big picture theory of the kinds of changes that we're seeing in our lower elevation forests. Not everyone 100% agrees with this historical model. There is, not surprisingly, not all the scientists are 100% on board with each other. There's always a little bit of difference of opinion, but generally that's the ecological story that we tell about our forests in these types of environments. And if we look at the recent history of wildfires in Colorado, we see that pattern. So this is data from the State Forest Service, and it only includes data for fires up until 2009, but the trend, if you think about the fires that we've been having, would continue. So what you see with the blue line is an uptick in the number of fires, and then this fuchsia line, what you see is a big uptick in the total acreages burned. And so it's kind of pointing towards that notion that our fires, that we're having fewer fires and bigger fires because we try and put out fires as soon as they happen. Okay, so that's my 30,000 foot wildfire ecology and ponderosa systems. And I want to shift gears to talk a little bit about watersheds themselves, so we can think about that interaction between wildfires and watersheds. So most of us, when we're walking about in the forest, or just if you're lucky enough like you to look out your front window and see forest, we think of, most of the watershed activity is the forests and the rivers that we see. That, I think if you ask most people where most of the water is, people will tell you it's right there in the creek. But when rain falls on the ground, actually in a quote-unquote healthy watershed, most of that water doesn't flow overland as surface flow. Most of that water infiltrates into the ground, eventually makes it back as groundwater and will contribute back to surface flow, but most of what we see, the surface runoff in our creeks and our rivers, is actually a small fraction of the total water budget in a watershed. In a undisturbed watershed or healthy watershed, most of the water, like I said, will go into the ground or it'll evapotranspirate back up through the trees. What's really important here is in an undisturbed watershed, this forest floor layer, this upper layer of the watershed or the soil horizon, that's where all the litter and the duff of the forest floor is. And that acts as like a slow sink or sponge for water that hits that ground. So when precipitation hits the ground and it hits that sponge, it moves slowly, sort of stays in place and moves slowly into ground. But a high intensity, high impact, catastrophic wildfire burns up all of that duff and that sponge layer. And so when that sponge is gone, it changes how water flows in the watershed. So instead of having that larger proportion of water infiltrating into the ground or up through the trees, there's no more evapotranspiration. Yeah, so when high intensity fires happen, we get that shift. The evapotranspiration, because the trees, the needles and the leaves are gone, the trees aren't pulling water up through that process anymore. And then it doesn't sink back into the ground slowly anymore. So instead what you get is a lot of water that's moving over the surface of the land. And that can combine with this other effect of high intensity wildfires, which is not only does the wildfire burn up that spongy layer, it changes the chemistry of the soil in some places and creates like some people refer to it as a waxy layer, but it's a hydrophobic layer in the soil so that water can't penetrate it. It's not just that sponge is gone, it's that the soil chemistry has now created like almost a mesh that is harder for water to move through. And so now you get this scenario where you've got way more water flowing over this surface, and there's a lot of debris on the surface, a lot of ash. So every time it rains, you get way more water flowing over the land. And when you get way more water, you get more velocity and you get more energy in that water. So that water just continues to rip off whatever is left on the soil surface. And so that combination of effects is why we see this really big uptick in runoff and floods and debris flows after big wildfires. And that's why, this is obviously a landscape we're all familiar with now. With that general theory in mind, when the Hyde Park fire happened, the natural resource managers looked at where they expected to see these types of high runoff events. And what you see on your right of the screen is some modeling that the Natural Resource Conservation Services did. So what they did is they took a couple of sample drainages in the burn area, Falls Gulch, Hill Gulch, Boyd Gulch, so those are small drainages along the main stem. And they modeled what a 10-year rain event would look like before the fire happened. And then what you see on the other graphs is the same drainages modeled for the same size of rain event, but after the fire. And this is the same axis, 0 to, sorry, I can't see that, 12,000. So what you see is this predicted huge jump in runoff volumes coming out for that same storm size. And then a similar effort was done across the whole burn area, looking at sub-drainages, and then predicting, basically looking at the sub-drainages across the burn area, and predicting increases in flood flow from a minimum of 116% increase to up to 4,000% increase in some of these sub-drainages. And so while these are predictions, they were modeled, many of these impacts held true, as we know, in the burn area. So these are just a few photos from around the initial assessments that were done. You can see these big debris flows. This is a close-up of a debris flow. That's just ash that built up in the main stem of the Poudre. So why do we care about these things? I mean, it's not just that it's kind of ecologically interesting that these changes happen, but these have big impacts. Again, not just on the people who live in the community, but we're all connected to this watershed in a lot of different ways. This map on the far left shows this red band here is high wildfire risk area right across the Front Range. And it's probably a little hard to see, but these yellow lines are like the conduits of high priority water supply. So the Poudre watershed supports drinking water supply for 300,000 people in the Front Range. And that's not including the agricultural water supply that it supports. Anything that limits or disrupts the water supply from the Poudre, because we're so dependent on taking water from it directly, can have huge impacts on our downstream economy, our lifestyles, our agricultural production. So, these types of events are really important to the watershed you live in is really important. But also, we saw, this is a picture after one of the first summer storms after the fire. This is the Colorado 14. This is just upstream from the Monroe Tunnel. And I like showing this picture because I think it shows a combination of some of these watershed values that are impacted by events like this. The sediment from this burn drainage consistently overtopped the 14 and blocked it. It created damage on the road. It blocked the culverts. CDOT had to eventually spend a lot of money to upgrade this culvert. It dumped tons of sediment directly into the main stem of the Poudre. You can still, to this day, see when the water levels drop, you can see a big plume of sediment that's sitting there. The 2013 floods helped to flush some of that out, but it's still there. Right here is the Monroe Tunnel, and that's the main diversion point for a lot of the agricultural water that goes out to the plains in Colorado. And this is a private landowner who lives up here, or now there's multiple private landowners up there, but at the time there was just one. So it brings together a whole host of those different aspects of how wildfires like this affect all the different values that we so appreciate about watersheds like the Upper Cache Poudre. And also, this watershed supports a lot of recreation, both in the slopes and in the river, and all of those things were very affected by the wildfire, and some of them to this day have still not opened up. That's Young's Gulch, which is still, as far as I know, still has not reopened. So the High Park Restoration Coalition worked together to take that information, those types of pieces of information, and prioritize the different drainages so that we could, obviously, with 87,000 acres, there would never be enough money to treat all of those acres. So we had to make some choices about what post-fire restoration we were going to do and where we were going to do it. And so we worked, like I said, across stakeholder groups to try and identify some of those highest priority issues. And it was, at the time, it was a bit of a challenge communicating that we were worried about erosion and runoff when people, like immediately after the fire, everyone was like, well, why aren't you planting trees? You should be out there planting trees because all the trees are gone. And we're like, well, no, because our roads are washing out and we might not be able to drink water, so we'll worry about the trees later. But yeah, so we went through this process of trying to identify which sub-drainages we had the highest expectations of seeing the most problems from, and then targeting those for different restoration techniques. Based on everything that I just said, our focus was really, we will never perfectly recreate that duff layer, only time, and the ecosystem will do that on its own. But what can we do to bring back some of that function of that duff layer to the hill slopes in these highest priority areas? So really fundamentally in that first sort of year or two, we were just trying to get stuff on the ground. It sounds very non-technical, but we were just trying to increase the ground cover. If you were living here during that time, you probably saw the helicopters whirring around and dropping things all the time. So a big focus of the restoration treatment initially was focusing on the hill slopes and trying to control that runoff and putting as much ground cover as possible back down on the ground. I was working on the volunteer side, which obviously there's a big trade-off, right? We can cover way more ground with a helicopter than we can individual people, although we did cover quite a bit of ground with individuals, but that's a lot more expensive. Really here, like I said, the goal and the purpose is to just get more roughness on the ground. And we used a variety of options of straw mulch, wood bark, like wood shred, and this is a manufactured product that's from Steamboat. They make wood straw out of pine needle kill logs. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's a little bit heavier. All of those different products have their own limitations and their own benefits. Straw mulch is usually the cheapest thing to use, but unless you can reliably find straw mulch that is certified weed-free, you have this potential to solve one problem and create another one for yourself down the road. So that was a significant issue. There's also another issue with straw mulch that, this is anecdotal and mostly my opinion. A lot of the aerial mulching was done in summer when it's dry and the soils are dry, and you're dropping dry straw and it moves around a lot. It worked really well when we did it by hand early in the season or late in the season when the ground was wet. It stayed really nicely in place. So one of the other things that we touched on with, I think it was your question, that how an intense fire like this changes the soil. What happens with these really high temperature fires is that it burns the seed bank. And so one of the other things that we tried to do, mostly only on the volunteer side, I don't think there was a ton of aerial seeding, but putting mostly native seeds on the ground to try and create ground cover for when the mulch either moves or degrades itself, that there'd be something else coming up. But also as a recognition that because a lot of that seed bank is gone, trying to reboot that system with as close as we could get locally adapted native seeds. The one seed that wasn't native that we put in our seed mixes was this species called triticale, which is a manufactured hybrid that is sterile. So it grows really quickly, like really surprisingly quickly. And then it grows up, it gets about this tall, it looks like wheat because it's a hybrid of wheat and rye. And then it grows up in the first year, provides some ground cover, and then dies. And then it just becomes mulch as the other seeds grow up underneath it. So what you see here is a picture from Redstone Canyon, and you can see this is the drainage we seeded. That is not the drainage that we seeded. So you can see this is 1 year after that seeding, so you can see a pretty striking difference in terms of within 1 year, the change that the benefits that we could see in 1 year from doing some seeding. There have been some longer term studies done in other post-fire environments that show over the long term, we can see some successful regeneration of native ground cover. So there's still not a lot of consensus or just not enough work that has been done to look at how doing this might affect those longer term trajectories of how natural regeneration would happen regardless. The early indications, at least in these immediate sort of first 5 years, is that we can see some benefits from doing this kind of seeding work. So similarly, this is a site that we worked on in Little Rock, doing some volunteer cane seeding. So this is in the May of 2013. This is the same site a year later, almost to the same day. So, we can see some pretty dramatic increases by doing this kind of work. And anecdotally, there's some evidence that by doing this, we help outcompete a little bit the invasive species that might be coming in as well. Can't eliminate them. They really like disturbed environment. So they do really well with this initial post-fire environment. So a couple other techniques that were used but were not quite as widespread were these efforts to create, like I said, more, it's about ground cover and slowing down water and creating roughness. So either making use of all of these dead trees and putting them on the slopes to create a barrier that would trap sediment, slow down water, and then just eventually sort of have revegetation, sort of capitalizing on that little microenvironment. Or using what are called straw wattles. It's basically the same idea. The difference between them is you have to pay for that one. You don't have to pay for this one. But this one's flexible, so you can move it along, you can shape it along contours of the hill slope. So in that sense, it's a little bit more flexible. I mean, you can use it in more scenarios. There's some debate about the efficacy of doing this kind of log erosion barrier work, because they're tricky to install well. And if you don't do them well, you can end up contributing to the problem as opposed to helping to slow the problem down. So there's some debate in some circles that not everyone really is keen on using these. Plus, even if you do have a crew who knows how to put them in well, it's super time consuming. So when you're looking again at tens of thousands of acres that need to be treated, these probably will never play a big role. But on a private land scenario where you yourself maybe have 5 acres and you're concerned about one particular drainage and you've got a chainsaw and a lot of trees and a couple friends, then it could potentially, as long as you really get good instruction on how to put them in, it could potentially play a good role in that scenario. But for this, like trying to reach landscape scale changes to post-fire runoff situations, the jury's still out.
How long do those models last?
Yeah, it sort of depends on how much sun exposure they get and what aspect of the slopes they're on. But I believe the estimated lifespan was like a 5 to 10-ish year kind of lifespan. They're wrapped in this is the one thing that I really didn't like about them, they're wrapped in a mesh, and it degrades, it's a plastic mesh that degrades with sun exposure. But that means that the top part of it degrades. The bottom part won't degrade until the rest of it does. But usually, at least when I've gone back and seen where we've put some wattles in, they get grown over, so you stop kind of noticing them. At least the ones that I've seen so far. Okay, so those initial couple years, we were really focused on, like I said, that hill slope component of just trying to slow water coming off the hills. But part of that excess runoff, what it does in the landscape is it not just creates more erosion on the slopes, but that excess water and energy eventually hits a drainage and kind of acts like a fire hose into that drainage, and then creates like a snowball effect in creeks. And so drainages that before the fire were maybe ephemeral, maybe we saw a little bit of runoff in them when it was spring runoff or something like that, have become perennial creeks now. They run all the time, and because there's so much more energy in them, the banks of the creeks themselves become unstable. And so they're not just delivering the sediment from these unstable hill slopes, they themselves are delivering more sediment. As we sort of moved from 2013 into 2014 and this year, we've started focusing a little bit more on these systems that are themselves unstable and continuing to cause problems. And one of the areas of major concern for us was what we refer to as the Skin Gulch drainage. For most of you, that's probably just the ditch that was next to Stove Prairie Road that you never paid attention to. So this is Stove Prairie Road, this is the 14, and Skin Gulch comes out of this side of the mountain. It's not a very big drainage, but it was severely burned during the fire, and every rainfall in that first year after the fire, it blew out. It just tons and tons of sediment and runoff came out of that. It consistently took out parts of Stove Prairie Road, I think 3 times. The county went in and put in all this pink riprap, and then it would rain again, and the rain would take the runoff, would take out the pink rocks, and so then you can see the pink rocks further downstream. And then September 2013 happened, and while we did not see the same level of damage in the Poudre watershed that, Big Thompson South did, one of the few areas where we did see big impacts, which is not surprising, was in Skin Gulch. And so during that event, a good chunk of Stove Prairie Road was taken out, and a lot of debris ended up in this portion of the channel. The county went in afterwards and cleared that debris, and in doing some of that emergency work, it created the floodplain didn't benefit from that work, let's just put it that way. And so we had a combined effect of the fire and the flood that we wanted to address. So we just finished our last volunteer project day there. But we've done, it's about the whole system portion of the system we worked on is about half a mile long of stream reach. And the goals of the project were really to reconnect the floodplain to the channel and create a better channel geometry so that the system itself could deal with that much water better, that it would dissipate the energy into its floodplain a little bit better, and create a more biodiverse floodplain that had more roughness and hopefully let go of some of its sediment before disgorging into the Poudre. The shift is, we can't do these types of things by hand. A lot of it was done by hand, but the channel work was heavy equipment work. So we had to work with a designer, landscape architect, and a heavy equipment operator, and the Forest Service, because the Forest Service property, to recreate a channel geometry that was, when we think of like a classic river, it has that sinuosity to it. There's some particular challenges at the site, notably that there's a road there, and the river clearly wants to go here, but there's a road there. And it's also designated Premel's jumping mouse habitat, so it's an endangered species, so there were some limitations to the design that we could do. So it was a really interesting experience, and we know what we should do, but this is what we can do, or we're allowed to do. But I think overall the project has so far been really successful. I'm looking forward to seeing how the creek takes it from here. This was our first major effort. It took us about a year to do this project from beginning to end, from planning, permitting, and implementation. We do still have several other projects that are in the queue that we're trying to do design and fundraising for. That photo that I showed you of the road near the Monroe Tunnel that got washed out, we have done some work in that drainage, but we have some other, it still has problems, so we're still trying to address those problems in that little drainage. Up, it's kind of cut off on this map, but there's an area that locally we refer to it as Ratville. There's a local community up there that refers to it as Monument Gulch. Technically, it's Forest Service 135. So there's another area there that has this similar problem where the creek is just unraveling. There was a road that was too close to the creek and has just, since the fires, has kind of jumped into the creek. So the creek and the road are one, and the road is not passable anymore, and it just is, contributing a lot of sediment to the South Fork of Poudre. And then we're still we haven't talked about it at all, but we're still actually working on the Gila Gulch fire as well. So although that was a much smaller fire, it sat right above the Seaman Reservoir. And one of the high severity burn drainages has continuously been disgorging sediment into the Seaman Reservoir and has created this quite sizable sediment delta at the northwest end of the reservoir, fairly close to where the inlet is. So there's some concern that if the delta gets too big, that it might create a blockage to the inlet. And it's because of the location, we can't dredge it. So we can't get equipment into there. So we're trying to think through what can we do with restoration techniques to at least stabilize that delta. So those are some of the ongoing post-fire projects that we still have in our sites. So we expect, just from those ones alone, that we'll probably be continuing to work on post-fire restoration at least for another couple of years, and continuing to monitor other areas that may be of concern, but we couldn't go back and reassess for whether they still had ongoing problems or not. So that's all I had to say about post-fire restoration. I did want to mention that, as I referenced at the beginning, we're not just working forever and ever on the Hyde Park fire, because at some point the burn area is going to start taking care of, well, it is starting to take care of itself, but at some point what we can do will go away. So So we're starting to think about what it is that we should be thinking about collaboratively on other parts of the watershed or other issues in the watershed. So we've been working for the past couple of months with similar stakeholders on creating a watershed plan for the upper watershed and really looking at some of these other watershed hazards and trying to think about where our most important watershed values are at greatest threat from those hazards. So right now it's really been a mapping exercise. This is where we think wildfires are most likely to happen. This is where there's a lot of steep slopes. This is where we think floods might have the biggest impacts. This is where roads are too close to the river and might create problems either for flooding, for communities, for the river, for all those types of things. We're getting pretty close to having a set of maps that we want to share with people and talk with the community about. So we're trying to organize community events, and we've been working with the Fire Protection District here to try and get a meeting date set up. So we're going to do a meeting here, hopefully in June. Basically something pretty informal and just putting up the maps and talking with people about what we're seeing and getting feedback and people's reactions for that. And helping, with the goal that this is going to help us target, similar to what we did with the post-fire work, but this will help us target where we can do work on the ground to help diminish the negative outcomes of some of these existing hazards that we have in the watershed. We have gone and we've done at the spatial desktop level, we have gone and re-looked at some of those areas, but we haven't had a chance. Mostly it was a timing issue. We ran out of time when we were doing our field or recheck our field surveys in winter to get out and do field surveys before it started snowing. So we haven't done the field checks. There's a bunch of areas in the burn area we couldn't do our field checks in, either because we couldn't get landowner permission or because the weather, we just ran out of time. Yeah, so we're going to try and do a couple more community meetings here and in other parts of the watershed. We also have an e-newsletter. So if you want to keep in touch with what we're doing, you can either sign up online or I put a sheet back there. You can sign up for our e-newsletter there. We also do have a stakeholder committee. It meets regularly, but it's dominated by people in Fort Collins. So that meeting typically happens in Fort Collins every other month. But my goal over the next year is to create a non-technical advisory committee that's more focused on the communities where we're working. So that hasn't yet formed, but if people are interested in that, you can also let me know about that. And that really would be to help inform us as we're doing work on the ground to make sure that we're doing the right things and that we're meeting people's needs. Yeah, that's about all I have. Well, thank you for